Now let me introduce you to the concept of attributes. You'll find yourself dealing with more and more attributes whenever you are working with Houdini because that's where the power lies. That raises the question, what is attribute? Attribute is a name value that can be stored on points, primitives, or vertex. Let's see in action in Houdini. So first let me create a geometry node. Okay, that is a empty SOP container. So let's dive inside. And in here, I'm going to create my rubber toy geometry. So let's add this. And here we have the rubber toy geometry. And if we hover over to that node and press and hold the middle mouse button, and here as you can see, we have some attributes on our geometry. So at the top, we can see the number of points, the primitives, and down here we have 2 points attribute. The first one is the n, so n is the normals, and the second one is the p, which means the position. And also we have a primitive attribute that stores the materials path where we have these materials. And we also have a vertex attribute that is uv. So first let's talk about the attribute n, which is the normal. Normals are the geometry normals that defines the direction of these faces, these primitives. And we can visualize these normal. If you come over here, we have this visualizer that says display normals. So if I enable that, and here as you can see, we have some of these lines. So these are the normals. These normals are actually storing the orientation in which all of the faces are facing. If we were to, let's say, reverse the normals, and here as you can see, we have this normal, and if I were to reverse this, so maybe it is easier if I just remove the shader. So let's bring up the parameter of our geometry. Here we have this add shader. Let me uncheck this. And here we have our shader is gone, but now we have this UV visualization, and we can also hide this UV visualization by clicking this button, show UV. Just click on it. So UVs are there, but we are just not visualizing them in the viewport. And here as you can see, if I enable that, here we have these point normals. So if I were to reverse this, let's say if I want to add a reverse node in here, let's create a reverse node. What this reverse node will does, it will reverse the normals of our geometry. So if I connect this and view the result, and here as you can see, now our geometry is facing inward. So if I enable my point display these normals, and right now it is still showing me the correct orientation. That is because I am currently viewing the point normal and not the primitive normal. And to actually view the primitive normal, we have this option that says display primitive normals. So if I enable this, and now here as you can see, our normals are actually inward. So if I were to just remove this, I can bypass this node. If you hover over to that node, and here as you can see, we have this yellow arrow. So it means the bypass. So if I enable this, here as you can see, now I am just bypassing the effect of this node. And here as you can see, we have these normal facing outward in the correct direction. And if I were to enable this, now my geometry is facing inward. And maybe I can visualize this better if I add a clip node in here. So let's add a clip node, and let's connect this after that and view the result of the clip node. And what the clip node does, let me hide this visualization normals. The clip node will just clip your geometry along an axis. And if we take a look at the parameter, as you can see, right now we have the direction. The x is set to 1, which means we are clipping our geometry along x plane. And if we take a look at this gnomon, here as you can see, that is our x-axis. And I can adjust the plane here by adjusting this parameter. It's just a basic clipping operation. So that's what clip node does. And here as you can see, our geometry is facing inward. And if I were to bypass this reverse node, and now here you can see we have the correct orientation over these faces. Okay, these are the geometry normals that define the orientation of our geometry, and that is called the N. If I middle mouse button, here you can see here we have the N. So let me remove this clip node and let's remove this reverse node. And if I middle mouse button, and here you can see now we only have the point and a UV attribute, vertex attribute, and right now we do not have a primitive this material path attribute. That is because we are not adding shader. So if I enable the add shader, and we have this materials assigned. So now if I middle mouse button, and here as you can see I have a one primitive attribute shop material path that store the location of where our this material is. So let's uncheck this. That's what the attribute is. And the UV, so UVs are come as an a attribute, and it is an a vertex attribute. So UV is always stored on the vertex level, although you can store on points as well, but generally they are at the vertex level. So if I enable my UV visualization, and also I can view this by going into my UV viewport. So if I come over here and let's go into the set view and let's enable the UV viewport. Let me zoom in, and here as you can see we have these UVs of our models. So these UVs are come as an a attribute. So if I were to remove this attribute, I can add an a attribute delete node. So let's add this and connect this in here, and we need to view this attribute delete, and here we can define which attribute that we want to remove. So onto the vertex level I want to delete the UV. So in here I can type UV, or I can just pick from here, and here as you can see we have an a UV. So here as you can see now the UVs are gone. So our this UV viewport is empty, and now if I middle mouse button, here as you can see we do not have an a vertex UV attribute. I can confirm if I go into my perspective view. So let's go into our perspective view, and here as you can see my UV visualization is on, but I do not see any UV visualization because we do not have UVs. Let's bypass this node, and here as you can see we have our UVs back. That is the UVs that comes as an a attribute. So let me remove this, and onto the attribute, onto this rubber toy geometry, maybe let's create an a attribute delete node. So we need that. Let's add this and connect this, and for this time I'm going to just click on this option delete non-selected. So which means if no attribute is defined, which means that all of the attributes will going to be deleted. So if let's enable the delete non-selected, and if I middle mouse button, and here as you can see I only have one point attribute, and that is the P. So P is the position of our these points. If I enable my point display, let's enable this, and here as you can see we have these points. I can view this P attribute, this position attribute, into the geometry spreadsheet. So if you come over here at the top, here you can see we have some different panes. So let's go into the geometry spreadsheet, and here we can view all of the attributes. And top here we have this attribute P, and here you can see it has three components, the P in X, Py, Pz. P is a vector attribute because it has three components. It has X, Y, and Z, and we can inspect all of the different kinds of attribute in our geometry spreadsheet. Right now we are visualizing the point attribute, and we can change this to vertices. So if I click this, and here you can see onto the vertices we have this point num attribute, and onto the primitive currently we do not have any attributes, and we have the detail, and we currently do not have any attributes on detail as well. So let's go into the points, and here we have this P which store all of the points. Here we have these point numbers. If I click on it, that will show me the order in the correct order. So we have point number 0, 1, 2, 3 and all of these points, and we have the corresponding values. P is essential because that is storing the position if I, maybe it's easier to visualize if I just remove all of the geometry. So I can say add an extract all points. Let me add the extract all points and connect this. And here you can see now we only have points and we do not have any primitives, but I can still see that we have the shape of our rubber toy, and that is because all of the points are placed in 3D space to make it look like our rubber toy geometry. So all of these points have a certain position value of the 3D space. If I enable my point number, and here as you can see we have all of these points and we have these numbers assigned to them. And if I zoom in, and here as you can see we have a point 11970. So that has a certain location in 3D attribute. It has a x value and y and z value in the 3D space. All of these points have their own unique position. Okay, so that's what storing in the geometry spreadsheet. This p attribute is, it's storing the location for all of these points. And if I were to zero out these values, so right now we have all of them their correct position. So I can make this position 0 by creating an attribute wrangle. I'm going to just quickly zero out the position and we will talk more about detail what I'm doing or how we can create this. But right now just let me create an example in here. So I'm going to call this one at p, so which means the position, and I'm going to just setting it to 0. So right now you do not need to worry about what I just did, but what I just did, just zero out the position. So let's go into the geometry spreadsheet, and here as you can see now we have these point numbers and all of these points have a value of 0, which means that now if I enable my point display, here as you can see now all of the points are at the origin. So it's saying that it's displaying that as if there is one point, but there is just all of the points are crushed down at the origin. I can enable my point number display. Let's enable this, and here as you can see we have some numbers on top of each other, which means all of the points are at the origin because all of the points has position of 0. So I can middle mouse button in here, and here as you can see we have all of these points. Okay, so the points are not gone but their position is 0. So let me remove this attribute triangle and go back, and here as you can see if I middle mouse button I still have same points, but now they have their position back, and now I can make that it's a rubber toy geometry. Okay, so that's what p is. We can create our own attribute after the extract all points. Maybe let's remove this and in here so that we have our geometry back. If I middle mouse button, okay, so we have points and primitives and vertices, all of them back in here. But right now we only have one attribute p position, which is essential for storing the location to make up this model. So in here I'm going to create my own attribute, and you can create your attribute by creating an attribute create node. So let's add this and connect this in here and onto the attribute create. In here we can define the name of our attribute that you want to create, and right now the name is set to attribute 1. So if I middle mouse button, and here as you can see now we have attribute 1 attribute, and we also have our this p, and here we can also see this data types. So it has this 3 float option, and the attribute 1 that we just created, it says FLT, which means the float. In here we need to define the name, so I'm going to call this one my underscore attrib. So let's rename this, and now if I middle mouse button, and here as you can see it has been renamed to my attrib, so that is the name that we just created. And down here we can define the class where we want to store the attribute. Right now we are storing this as an a point attribute. I can change this to primitive. So if I now middle mouse button, and here as you can see our position has been shifted. Now it is an a1 primitive attribute. My attrib is an a primitive attribute. And now I can check if I go into the geometry spreadsheet. Here as you can see now I'm visualizing the point attribute, and there I cannot see my attribute because that is on the primitive. So let's click on this primitive, and here we have my attribute. I can change the class to point attribute if I want. So now I can go back, and here as you can see, now I have a point attribute, or I can change this to a detail attribute. So we need to go into the detail, and here as you can see, the detail only have one value. So detail is a attribute that contains the geometry as a whole. So all of the points and primitives are stored in as an a. Detail is actually just the geometry as a whole, so it's only have one value in here. So if I were to change this to primitives and go back, and here as you can see, we have all of these primitive numbers, and all of the primitives number will get our this attribute, my attrib 0. And in here we can define the type. Right now we are storing the attribute as an a float type. We can change this to integer or an a vector, and here as you can see, by changing this to vector, now we have three value. We have the x, y, and z, and we can check if I middle mouse button, and here as you can see, we have one primitive attribute and it's 3 float, and here we have this one vec, which means the vector. Let's talk about what all of these data types are. So first we have the float. So let me enable the notepad in here. So first we have a float. Float is stores the floating point numbers. For example, we could have a value of 1.0. Okay, so that is a floating point value. Or I can say we have a value of, let's say, 1.35. Now that is another floating point example. I can change this to any number, let's say 78 point something. So all of these are examples of floats. Okay, so that is a data type of float. And we also have a data type called integer. So what is an integer? Is integer contains the whole number. For example, 1 is a integer, the number of 5 or 6 or 100. So the whole number. So integer cannot contain, let's say, number of 1.35. Okay, that is a wrong data type because it's not a whole number. So integer only contain the whole number. For example, 700, you can type anything, as long as it does not have any fractional part. Okay, because then that will change the data type to float. So these are the integer. And we also have another data type called vector. Vector contains 3 value. We could have a floating point value for the x. We also have value for y, and we also have z. So vector contain 3 values. Vector has 3 components, the x, y, and z components. So the example of vector can be the position. So if you are going to store the position has 3 value. We have the position for the x, y, and for the z in 3D space. And for the color, if you are working with color, so color have an R and G and B components. So we have red, green, and blue values. So that could be a example of vector attribute. And we also have a attribute type called string. So string contain the character or words. For example, if I want to store the hello world, so that is a string data type. I can say anything, let's say Houdini. So all of these character and words, all of these are what called these strings. And we also have some other data types, matrix, and all of them, but these are the basics so that we're going to talk about. Let me minimize this notepad and onto the class. Here we can define the class where we want to store, and here we can define the type. Okay, so we have this one float, and we can define in here, we have this one the default value, and we have the value. So here I can define which value I want to store. So if I were say that my attrib, it's a float, I want to store a value of 1.35, and here as you can see, my attributes value has been changed to 1.35. I can change this to anything that I want, 125, and here as you can see, here we have the value. and I can change this to integer, and here as you can see the fraction part is gone, so which means I can only store the whole number. I can say 1 2, or if I were to say 12.5, and here as you can see it has been round to 13 because it cannot store 12.5. I can change this to 12.4 and it will only just store the value of 1 2 because it is an integer attribute data type. I can change this to vector, and here as you can see now we have three components. We have an x, y and z, and we can define them in here. That is the x value, and here as you can see I can store the y value to something else, let's say 45, and here as you can see the y value has been changed. I can change the z value, let's change this to 78, and here as you can see we have these three values. And also I can change this to string, and in here I can type anything in here. I'm going to type in here hello world, and here as you can see we have this hello world written in our this primitive my attrib, and we can inspect if I middle mouse button, and here as you can see we have one primitive attribute my attrib, and its data type is str, which means it's a string. And same way if I change this to vector, and if I middle mouse button, here as you can see now we have 3 float, it's a vector attribute. I can change this to integer, and now if I middle mouse button, here I have the data type int. Okay, so which means that it's an integer attribute. I can change this to float, let's middle mouse button, and here we can see the attribute type, it is says FLT, which means it's float.